Hi, folks, and welcome to a discussion of Chapter 14 covering American foreign policy. This is the last chapter in our textbook. Yes, we have a final exam coming up in a few weeks. We'll wrap things up this week and we'll have a review week and then on to the final exam. I'll tabulate the final discussion grades after this week so you'll know where you stand going into that. The final exam will be cumulative. That means it'll cover material throughout the entire semester, 70 questions. About a third of the questions will come from this week's materials because we don't have a quiz this week. Other questions are going to be questions that you have seen on previous quizzes. You'll have a minute per question, 70 minutes. The best way to prepare for the final exam, obviously, is to read Chapter 14 very carefully and review this week's assigned film. Make sure that you look at all previous PowerPoint presentations, or at least the outline PDFs, and review key terms from each chapter. So look in the back of the text, review the summary, review those key terms and concepts. And if you do all that, you should be ready to rock for the final exam. Most of you have done quite well on the quizzes so far. Also, be sure to register for fall and summer classes for the best selection. If you're interested in continuing on in political science, Intro to Political Science is a good next step. That's a comparative class. Much more international in nature, so we look at different political systems around the world and we draw comparisons. We will also offer state and local politics next year. We'll offer a constitutional law, and we do offer the Associate of Arts Transfer Pathway degree for people who are interested in poli-sci as a major or interested in a related major. And I'm always happy to meet with you and discuss that. And the outline of that program is also available on the Inver Hills website. All right, the learning outcomes for this week. We're going to define foreign policy. We'll identify how U.S. foreign policy is an ever-changing mixture of moral idealism and political realism. We'll discuss recent U.S. foreign policy changes. We'll define the roles played by the President, the executive branch, and related agencies, and Congress in making foreign policy. And we'll identify key historical themes in United States foreign policy. Okay, what's foreign policy? Well, foreign policy is a country's external goals and the techniques, the strategies used to achieve them. America's foreign policy also includes our national security policy to protect the independence, the political, the economic integrity of the United States. And this, of course, takes on added weight when the United States is the world's largest economy and it has the most powerful military. So American foreign policy is important not only to people within the United States, but is critically important to the world. Okay, tools of foreign policy. Diplomacy refers to the process by which states in the international arena, different countries, they carry on relations with each other. The term also means settling conflicts peacefully, so there's some shades of meaning there. Some of the ways that the United States does this is through economic aid, assistance to other nations through grants, loans, or credits. But there are usually strings attached, and some of those strings are to buy American products, the assisting nations products in doing so. So when the United States, for example, gives food aid, it is through American farms and American farmers and food suppliers that would provide that aid, for example. The United States also provides technical assistance to countries, so sending individuals or organizations with expertise in agriculture, engineering, or business to aid in the development of other nations. How do we perceive the world? How do our leaders perceive the world? How do we as individuals? And this view informs how we approach American foreign policy. On one end of the spectrum is moral idealism that sees nations in the international arena as willing to cooperate and agree on certain standards for conduct. We can cooperate. We can come up with solutions that meet the needs of those countries that we share certain values with. On the other end of the spectrum is political realism that sees each country, regardless of whether they're democratic or authoritarian or whatever, they're acting principally in their own interest. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there, and everyone is looking for an advantage. So you need to focus on your country. That's your goal, and not necessarily cooperation. So in discussion this week, think a little bit about how different or more recent presidential administrations have seen the world? Is it more through a lens of moral idealism or political realism? Okay, and you take a look at a slogan recently used by President Trump, and it has been used elsewhere in American history, which is America First. You know, what 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 view of America, well, foreign policy does that really define? It's an eventful time in world history that we're living through right now. And of course, the United States is the largest global economy, and the United States is having the most powerful military in the world, obviously has a leading role to play. We see an increasingly belligerent Russia under Putin, so much so that the Russian government involved itself in the United States last election in 2016 in an attempt to sway the outcome. We see the outcome of the Syrian civil war and the related refugee crisis, the rise of ISIS in countries that lack central authority and good governance. We see the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian government against its own people. We see the breakdown of the nuclear agreement the United States had with Iran to curb and halt or at least suspend its nuclear program that has broken down. We are in a position of global economic crisis as a result of the COVID-19 epidemic, the lingering effects of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that had an uncertain outcome, and the fact that the United States still has a number of troops still in both places. We already discussed environmental issues, climate change, energy, and of course these are domestic issues within the United States, but environmental issues don't stop at borders. Energy issues are truly global, so there's also a foreign policy component to this. Of course, you see terror still, and the practice, strategy of terrorism still very much in effect here we are 20 years, almost 20 years after 9/11. Nuclear proliferation in North Korea. China is a rising power and starting to become, the world is becoming, instead of sort of a unipolar world where the United States is the only superpower, going back to a bipolar world as the United States was with the Soviet Union. China is now rising and gaining on the United States as an economic and as a military power. We are also seeing the political erosion, somewhat, although not entirely, of Europe. So the European Union kind of came together as a single economy, and this developed after World War II as an effort to bring these former warring nations together and to bind them with certain laws and practices in a single economy, and in a lot of cases a single currency. But we are seeing somewhat of erosion within the European Union. The United Kingdom has voted to leave the European Union. They're in the process of doing that. And then we're also seeing some rise of authoritarianism in Europe, in Hungary and in Poland. We're starting to see a rise of non-democratic, illiberal forces in Europe. Presidents of the United States kind of get blamed for everything, and in some cases get the credit for whatever takes place during their time in office. Of course, Congress has a role to play in that. Most governing happens at the state and local level, so sometimes it may not be fair to credit or to blame the president for everything that occurs during their time in office. But one area where the president of the United States really does have a great deal of power, and that's in American foreign policy. The president of the United States is a leader when it comes to directing the American relationship with the rest of the world. This is driven through some very clear constitutional powers. The president swears to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Of course, the president is commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and the United States has the most powerful military that the world's ever known and can project that power anywhere in the world. The president of the United States appoints ambassadors, although they do have to be confirmed by the Senate. Negotiates treaties with other countries. Again, those have to be ratified by the Senate, but still the president is the chief negotiator, the lead negotiator. And the president can also enter into legal agreements with other countries, executive agreements, as we've already explored. Now, there are a great deal of informal powers that the president enjoys. More access to information than anybody else in government through the intelligence community, the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the NSA. The president can influence Congress and direct Congress when it comes to foreign policy. Congress is much less effective. There are just simply too many voices in Congress to sort of take the reins of American foreign policy. The president can most directly influence foreign policy through prominent speeches, rose garden speeches at the White House, speaking to the American people, and in an effort to commit the country as a whole to a course of action. And a president's success on foreign policy or weakness on foreign policy often comes down to, have they convinced the country that their actions or inactions are critical? Other sources of American foreign policy, of course, there's the United States Congress. Congress has the power of the purse strings. They need to fund any foreign aid. They need to create any new program through law or any new agency through law and, again, fund it. So Congress has a role to play. It's not a leading role, but it's certainly a role. And then, of course, there's the related agencies and bureaucracies of government. The Department of State, that is the cabinet level department that most directly deals with diplomacy. Through the Department of State that all ambassadors they must answer to the Secretary of State, who answers to the President of the United States, and run all the embassies around the world. So the Department of State is very critical. The National Security Council that officially advises the president on national security matters, and this is the director of the CIA and the director of the FBI and the Secretary of State and these key officials that report to the President of the United States, but also advise the President of the United States on national security matters. Again, the president has the resources of the largest intelligence community on earth and all the data that's being gathered through the military and through the CIA and the NSA and these other agencies. Let's take a quick romp through American foreign policy history. For much of United States history, you could describe American foreign policy as being negative or isolationist. There's a profound mistrust of Europe. American leaders are trying to stay out of European affairs. The United States is militarily weak during this time. There's much more of a focus on economic development in the United States. This is shaped by President Monroe's doctrine, which says if it's not in the Western Hemisphere, we're not going to worry about it. That's not our zone of influence. We're going to stay out of Europe. Now, the Spanish-American War, which occurred in 1898, and World War II, 1918, these were temporary entanglements from an American perspective. The Spanish were a weakened colonial power. It was seen as an opportunity to sort of pluck some of their colonial possessions from them, including the Philippines, Puerto Rico, greater control and influence in Cuba, and so on. And that, of course, was seen as within the American zone of influence. American involvement in World War I was important, and maybe some could even argue pivotal, but it was limited and it occurred toward the end of that conflict. So you could certainly argue the United States helps hasten the end of World War I. But American involvement in World War I was much more limited relative to World War II. And in both cases, the Spanish-American War and World War I, there was a quick return to isolationism following those conflicts. This changes with the bombing of Pearl Harbor and ushers in an era of internationalism where the United States starts to match its military powers with its economic powers. So we see a significant increase in defense spending, obviously, as the United States builds up for participation in World War II and stages a two-front war both in the Pacific and in Europe. But even as the United States was fully engaged in World War II, the war was not fought on American territory with the exception of Pearl Harbor. It was not fought in the continental United States. So after World War II, Japan's devastated, much of the world's devastated, Europe is particularly devastated, and the United States emerges with actually a stronger economy after World War II, as actually providing the equipment and the resources to conduct the war to our allies around the world. The United States economy is strengthened, and the rest of the world is devastated.
And of course, the United States also at this point is the only country with nuclear weapons, because the United States obviously develops and uses nuclear weapons against the Japanese in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Another profound influence of World War II is that it ushered in the Cold War. This is the ideological, political, and economic impasse between the U.S. and the Soviet Union following World War II. Spend a little time in your reading going over some of the major historical flashpoints of the Cold War. But in some ways, the Cold War hasn't ended. I mean, the Soviet Union disintegrated, but our relationship with Russia today has a lot of the tensions and animosity um, and distrust that we saw during the Cold War. And so, even though the Soviet Union is no more, we continue to see a global rival in modern Russia after um, some brief experiments with democracy. Russia has become again an authoritarian state. Okay, we're keeping this overview of the final chapter brief. And to summarize, foreign policy includes the nation's external goals and the techniques and strategies used to achieve them. Diplomacy involves the nation's external relationships, and it's an attempt to solve problems, conflicts peacefully. The rise of China as a superpower raises a series of issues, including trade and human rights. To establish some limits on the power of the president, Congress did pass the War Powers Act in 1973, but again, the president is really in the driver's seat when it comes to American foreign policy and the president's commander in chief function. The end of the policy of isolationism was completed with the United States' entry in World War II, and the Cold War followed. And there were brief periods where the United States, of course, engaged in Europe and with European powers, and I already referred to that, both the Spanish-American War and World War I. Under President Putin, Russia remains an authoritarian state after some brief experiments with democracy, and has reignited the Cold War in a lot of ways, both in Europe and the United States.
Okay, here are your final discussion questions of this semester. You know the drill by now: one substantial original post and at least 2 responses to your classmates' on-topic posts. Do finish strong. I'll have your final participation scores posted next week. I'll also have any grading done of late papers that are submitted by the final deadline. So you'll go into the final exam with a pretty clear idea of where you stand. It's been great working with you this semester. Please reach out to me with any questions or concerns. And I'm also available if I can be of any help to you down the road, particularly if you're interested in political science or a related major. Have a fantastic final couple weeks studying American politics. And again, let me know if you have any questions at all.